Emily Turner smiled at the funeral, and Charles Turner held her hand 2 days later. They were husband and wife, and Nathan Turner, her husband and his son, was buried in a shallow grave. The town of Willow Creek had never seen anything like it. What began as a tragic murder unraveled into a chilling tale of deception, betrayal, and a secret so twisted it left everyone asking, how far would someone go for control, and how blind can love truly be? Emily and Nathan Turner were known throughout Willow Creek as the Golden Couple. Their house, nestled at the end of Maple Drive, always had a freshly cut lawn, flowers in bloom, and the faint smell of cinnamon drifting out from Emily's kitchen window. She ran a modest but popular home bakery, delivering cupcakes and pies to local shops, while Nathan, tall and quiet, worked as a construction supervisor with a well-respected local firm. Together they seemed calm, content, and deeply rooted in their community. To the neighbors, there were no signs of trouble. They attended church on Sundays, hosted backyard barbecues in the summer, and donated generously during local fundraisers. Nathan's father, Charles Turner, lived 2 streets away in a tidy brick home that had belonged to his late wife. After his retirement, Charles kept to himself, tending to his roses and reading crime novels. Emily would stop by his home regularly to check in on him, sometimes bringing fresh pastries or home-cooked meals. It was a gesture many admired, calling her the model daughter-in-law. But beneath the polite smiles and sunny greetings, a quiet tension had begun to simmer within the Turner household. Over the past year, Nathan's demeanor had shifted. He had always been reserved, but now he was distracted, withdrawn, and at times impatient. He came home late more often, claiming the company was behind schedule and required extra hours on site. Emily never pressed, at least not in front of anyone. But close friends noticed that she no longer seemed cheerful. She appeared tired, frequently lost in thought, and occasionally snapped during casual conversations. What no one knew was that the distance between Emily and Nathan wasn't caused by work stress. Nathan had grown suspicious of Emily, of the long hours she claimed to spend volunteering, of her regular visits to his father. He never voiced these concerns aloud, but he kept track in a worn leather notebook, dates, times, little details that didn't add up. He didn't want to believe something was wrong, but the evidence, though vague, was growing. Emily, for her part, had become increasingly close to Charles. What started as occasional visits to help him with meals or errands had become late-night talks, shared wine, and intimate silences. Emily knew how to make people feel needed, and Charles, lonely since his wife's passing, found her warmth comforting. Over time, boundaries blurred. He began giving her financial advice, then access to certain accounts, and eventually control over small expenses. To him, she was family loyal, caring, trustworthy. To Emily, Charles was more than that. He was an opportunity. No one could say exactly when Nathan vanished. On a rainy Thursday evening, he left work around 6:30 p.m., according to his foreman, and was expected home by 7. He never arrived. Emily reported him missing the next morning, claiming she thought he had stayed out late drinking with coworkers. At first, no one panicked. Nathan was a grown man, after all. Maybe he just needed time to cool off, or maybe there had been a misunderstanding. But by the second day, when his phone remained off and his car hadn't turned up, the police launched a formal investigation. They found his vehicle abandoned near a wooded trail outside of town, doors locked, keys missing. A search team combed the surrounding area, and 3 days later, a hiker stumbled upon a shallow grave concealed beneath a rotting log. Inside was Nathan's body. He had blunt force trauma to the head and dirt packed beneath his fingernails, as though he'd tried to claw his way out. There was no identification on him, no wallet or phone. The coroner estimated he'd been dead for roughly 2 days. The discovery devastated the town. The idea that someone as familiar and well-liked as Nathan could be murdered shocked everyone. Willow Creek was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked. Violent crime was unheard of. The funeral was held 3 days later, a modest service at the local chapel. Emily arrived in a black dress and veil, supported by Charles on one arm and her sister on the other. She wept quietly throughout the service, only speaking once to thank everyone for coming. Her grief, though muted, appeared sincere to most who attended, but what happened next turned shock into suspicion. Exactly 2 days after the funeral, Emily walked into the Willow County Courthouse with Charles Turner by her side. Together, they submitted paperwork for a marriage license. No one knew about it until the clerk, stunned by the names on the forms, mentioned it to a reporter who occasionally covered court filings. The news broke the following day. Widow marries father-in-law 2 days after son's funeral. The headline spread fast. Social media exploded. The quiet streets of Willow Creek buzzed with outrage, disbelief, and endless speculation. What could possibly explain such a bizarre and inappropriate union? Some residents tried to defend Emily, suggesting she and Charles had grown close during the tragedy and had made a rash decision fueled by grief. But most weren't convinced. The timing was too strange, the marriage too sudden. And beneath it all was a chilling question that no one could answer had Nathan known. As investigators resumed looking into the murder, new questions began to surface. Why had Emily insisted on a closed-casket funeral when Nathan's injuries weren't disfiguring? Why had she suddenly shut down her bakery the day after his body was found? Why was Charles Turner, a man known for being cautious and deliberate, rushing into a marriage that defied logic? None of it made sense. Detectives returned to the trail where Nathan's body had been discovered, scouring the area for anything they might have missed. And it was there, near a broken branch several feet from the grave, that a crime scene technician spotted a small piece of red thread. It was barely visible, tangled among leaves and dirt. But under the microscope, it matched the fibers of a scarf Emily had worn in a photo on the day Nathan disappeared. The case had officially taken a darker turn. What began as a tragic, unexplained murder was starting to look like something far more calculated and far more sinister. The whispers around town grew louder. Was it love, grief, madness, or murder? The news of Emily's marriage to Charles Turner sent a ripple of disbelief through the town. It wasn't just scandalous, it was unfathomable. Willow Creek, though quiet and close-knit, had its share of gossip, but nothing could have prepared its residents for such a shocking twist. A woman marrying her father-in-law only 2 days after her husband's funeral wasn't just unconventional, it was disturbing. No one could understand how a grieving widow could move on so quickly, let alone with her dead husband's father. Emily and Charles did not respond to any media questions. They disappeared from public view for a while, rarely leaving Charles's house, which now had its curtains drawn shut at all times. When they did appear in town, usually for groceries or brief errands, they avoided eye contact, speaking little and moving quickly. Charles, who once exchanged gardening tips with his neighbors, now walked with his head down. Emily, once praised for her kindness and warmth, now drew long, cold stares from former friends who crossed the street to avoid her. The police, initially treating Nathan's murder as a possible robbery gone wrong, began revisiting every detail of the case. The marriage changed everything. What once seemed like a tragic loss now reeked of motive. Investigators pulled back the initial reports and reanalyzed all available evidence. The wound on Nathan's head was consistent with a heavy, blunt object, likely something from his own home. There were no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds, and no DNA under his fingernails, suggesting he hadn't struggled much. It began to appear as if Nathan had known and trusted his killer. The search for overlooked evidence led detectives to re-examine the surroundings of the burial site. It had been an unusually clean crime scene, no blood, no fingerprints, no signs of a struggle. But a single tire track had been photographed by a junior officer, partially imprinted in the soft dirt. Though it was incomplete, forensic analysts believed it matched the make of Emily's sedan, which she claimed hadn't left her driveway for days. Investigators began requesting surveillance footage from homes near the wooded trail. One elderly homeowner, whose property bordered the area, had a security camera facing the road. The footage, grainy and time-stamped just after dusk on the night Nathan disappeared, showed a car stopping briefly before its headlights shut off. Though it was difficult to confirm the license plate, the shape and damage on the rear bumper were consistent with Emily's vehicle, which had been scratched in a minor accident months prior. Meanwhile, detectives began to look deeper into Emily and Charles's financial activities. They subpoenaed bank records and traced transactions dating back 6 months. What they uncovered surprised even the most seasoned investigators. Large, frequent deposits had been made to a secondary checking account in Charles Turner's name, an account that had previously been dormant. The money, always in uneven amounts, had originated from Nathan's business account. Emily, who had limited access to Nathan's books through their shared home office, had been slowly funneling funds into the secondary account over time. Nathan hadn't noticed until just weeks before his death. One of Nathan's colleagues recalled a conversation in which Nathan mentioned something strange about the books. He had noticed unusual deductions, payments made to companies he had never heard of, and expenses that didn't match up with work orders. He hadn't said much else, only that he would take care of it soon. Investigators believed that Nathan had confronted Emily privately and possibly even Charles. That confrontation might have been what ultimately sealed his fate. The mystery deepened further when detectives uncovered that Emily had taken out a large life insurance policy on Nathan only 4 months before his death. The policy, signed and processed without Nathan's direct involvement, had been completed through a third-party broker who claimed Emily insisted on handling the paperwork. Though technically legal due to their marriage, the way she managed to process it raised red flags. The police began compiling a timeline. Emily had slowly isolated Nathan, managing finances, limiting his time with friends, and subtly creating friction between him and Charles. She had manipulated both men in different ways. With Nathan, she played the loyal, overworked wife. With Charles, she became a devoted caretaker, visiting often, cooking meals, offering companionship. It now seemed like every move she made had a purpose, and every relationship had been part of a long-term plan. But there was still the matter of Charles. Was he an accomplice or another victim? Friends who had once seen him as grounded and logical now said he seemed confused, foggy, and far more dependent on Emily than before. He had always been sharp, even in retirement, but recently he seemed to forget things mid-sentence and repeated himself often. Doctors attributed this to stress, but one nurse anonymously told detectives that Emily often brought Charles herbal supplements and insisted he take them privately, away from the staff supervision. A warrant was issued to test the supplements. Lab analysis confirmed that some of the capsules contained small doses of lorazepam, a medication used to treat anxiety but known to cause drowsiness, confusion, and memory loss if misused. Detectives theorized that Emily had been drugging Charles, possibly to keep him compliant or suppress his memory of events. Despite mounting evidence, Emily remained quiet. She refused to speak to police beyond what her lawyer permitted. Charles, for his part, was unaware or pretended to be. When detectives asked him basic questions about Nathan's death or his new marriage, he became vague, at times genuinely confused. It became increasingly difficult to determine whether he was hiding something or had truly been manipulated into silence. The investigation began to draw public attention beyond Willow Creek. Regional news outlets picked up the story, labeling Emily as the Black Widow of Willow Creek. Internet sleuths dissected her every move, posting theories and timelines on forums. Some believed she had planned the murder from the beginning, that she had always intended to marry Charles. Others believed she was after something even more sinister: control over the Turner estate, which was now legally hers through marriage. Emily's attorney maintained her innocence, stating that the marriage was an emotional decision between two grieving people who found solace in each other. But the evidence was telling another story, one of fraud, deceit, and manipulation. The community that once admired her had now turned entirely. Former friends shunned her in public. Businesses refused her service. Her home was vandalized more than once. But despite all this, Emily never seemed rattled. In public, she walked with a straight back and expressionless face. In court, during preliminary hearings, she stared blankly ahead. She wasn't grieving, she wasn't angry, she was unreadable. As the investigation entered its 3rd month, one thing had become clear. The woman once seen as the sweet, helpful neighbor now stood at the center of a murder mystery that was only beginning to unravel. Detectives knew they were dealing with a web far more tangled than anyone had expected. By the time the 3rd month of the investigation arrived, what had started as a suspicious murder had evolved into a full-blown psychological puzzle. On a laptop recovered from Emily's home office, investigators found a folder marked Receipts. Emily didn't have power of attorney, but Charles's signature was on every document. When questioned, Charles seemed unsure, admitting he may have signed some papers but didn't remember when or why. It also outlined suspicions about unusual financial activities and suggested he planned to report them. They brought in forensic accountants, cyber analysts, and even a psychologist to analyze Emily's behavioral patterns. At the time, she was listed as a companion and caregiver. After his death from a medication overdose, Emily had attempted to claim part of his life insurance. She became the subject of podcasts, crime blogs, and late-night news coverage, and that Emily had been unfairly judged due to media pressure. But the walls were closing in. The marriage to Charles had not given her the protection she likely hoped for. A forensic geolocation expert managed to recover deleted GPS data from Emily's phone. On the night Nathan disappeared, her phone had been in motion near the woods for over 30 minutes. She claimed she had been asleep at home. But the GPS data showed otherwise her route aligned perfectly with the road that led to the trailhead near the burial site. Investigators cross-referenced the timestamps with a local security camera that showed a car matching her description pulling onto the access road around 8:45 p.m. and fall of a woman willing to sacrifice everything and everyone for wealth, control, and power. Because of his deteriorating mental state, the court had frozen all joint accounts and launched a conservatorship hearing to determine if Charles was capable of managing his own affairs. Doctors advised he wasn't. Theories abounded. Some claimed she had planned Nathan's murder from the day they met, while others believed she had initially been sincere but saw an opportunity and took it. Whatever the truth was, one thing was clear: Emily had placed herself at the center of a growing storm. However, since there was no legal or marital tie, her claim was denied. The life insurance policy, the secret accounts, the effort to control Charles's finances, it all pointed to premeditation. On the night Nathan disappeared, she likely lured him out under the guise of a conversation. Emily had spent years carefully crafting her image, earning trust, and manipulating the people closest to her. Her actions were cold, strategic, and deliberate. She wasn't simply a grieving widow who fell into an inappropriate marriage. She was the architect of a chilling plan that only unraveled because of small oversights, a fiber on a branch, GPS data she forgot to erase, and a past that refused to stay buried. In the secluded woods, away from cameras and witnesses, she killed him using a heavy object, possibly a tool from Charles' shed, and buried the body in a shallow grave. Police had investigated, but with no direct evidence, the case went cold, and Emily vanished shortly after. Her life began to unfold in layers, each one revealing something more calculated. She had legally changed her name 6 years prior, claiming it was to distance herself from a traumatic childhood, but deeper research revealed something else. Investigators now had motive, means, and mounting circumstantial evidence that pointed directly to Emily. She had not only the opportunity but a clear incentive to silence her husband before he could legally block her access to his assets, a young woman living with an older man, a sudden and unexplained death, an attempt to claim financial benefits. And now, years later, a husband found murdered, followed by a quick and questionable marriage to her elderly father-in-law. The pattern could no longer be ignored. He appeared confused about the account entirely. Medical experts were called in to evaluate his condition, and what they found only deepened concerns. Charles was suffering from early-stage cognitive impairment, worsened by prolonged exposure to a sedative drug that matched the substance found in the supplements Emily had been giving him. It was hidden in a rarely accessed drive partition, suggesting she hadn't expected anyone to look that deeply. Inside were dozens of PDFs, scans of altered invoices, payment records from Nathan's company, and transaction histories that didn't match any legitimate business expenses. It quickly became clear that money had been siphoned from Nathan's accounts in small, carefully disguised amounts just under the radar to avoid detection. Nathan Turner's death was no longer being viewed as a random act of violence. It had become the centerpiece in a chilling story of betrayal, manipulation, and greed. And at the heart of it all stood Emily Turner, calm, reserved, and hauntingly composed. As the forensic team continued combing through evidence, they made a breakthrough that altered the course of the investigation. The trail pointed to a single account, one in Charles Turner's name, opened shortly after Emily began visiting him regularly. Meanwhile, the financial investigation led police to another significant discovery. Alongside the new will that Nathan had allegedly been drafting, there were emails between Nathan and a lawyer based in a nearby town. In those emails, Nathan expressed concerns about potential financial misconduct and asked about the process for modifying a will without notifying his spouse. The lawyer responded with detailed steps, but the final draft was never signed. It remained in Nathan's inbox, timestamped just 1 week before his death. The unsigned will was crucial. In it, Nathan had removed Emily as sole beneficiary, placing a large portion of his estate into a trust for future children or extended family. The prosecution team started building their case with these new elements. Before becoming Emily Turner, she had been Emily Brooks, a name linked to a cold case in Michigan, involving the suspicious death of a wealthy elderly man she had been living with. Now that past had returned. Though there was no direct evidence linking her to that death, the similarities were enough to raise alarm. Public opinion, already turning against Emily, solidified. Despite all this, Emily remained silent. Her lawyer issued standard statements denying all allegations, asserting that the evidence was circumstantial, that meant Emily no longer had financial control. Then came another piece of damning evidence. By now, the prosecution had a nearly complete timeline. Emily, knowing Nathan was planning to change his will and possibly expose her, had acted quickly. 2 days later, she married Charles to secure her access to the Turner estate before any legal changes could threaten her position. The community, once hesitant to accept the dark truth, now began to see the full picture. The case, once thought to be a tragic anomaly, had transformed into something else entirely, the calculated rise. By the time the case against Emily Turner reached its 4th month, the investigators had built a mountain of circumstantial evidence. But what they lacked was a clear confession or direct forensic proof linking her to the moment of Nathan Turner's death. That missing piece kept Emily out of handcuffs, for now. But the deeper the detectives dug, the more they realized just how much of Nathan's life had been quietly dismantled by the woman he had trusted most. The turning point came when they obtained access to Nathan's private cloud storage. His personal email, notes, calendar entries, and saved voice memos were reviewed meticulously. Among dozens of routine reminders and construction site updates, investigators discovered a folder titled Insurance Emily. Inside were screenshots of text messages, copies of bank transfers, and even surveillance photos of Emily entering Charles Turner's house late at night. There were no timestamps on the images, but Nathan had labeled each file with dates and notes like another visit after 10 p.m., and Charles doesn't look awake. He had been collecting evidence quietly and methodically. The implication was chilling. He had begun to suspect not just infidelity, but conspiracy. Among the documents was a half-written letter addressed to a law firm. Nathan had never sent it, but it detailed concerns that his wife and father were collaborating on something that could destroy everything. It was vague, emotional, and written just days before his disappearance. The tone was panicked, almost desperate. It showed Nathan had been afraid. Not just angry or hurt, but genuinely scared. The discovery intensified the scrutiny on Charles Turner. Detectives arranged for a court-appointed psychiatrist to conduct a formal evaluation of Charles's mental state. The results confirmed a rapid cognitive decline that didn't match the usual pace of age-related memory loss. There were strong indicators of long-term chemical exposure. The sedatives detected in his bloodstream during his earlier hospitalization hadn't been a one-time event. They had likely been administered over weeks, maybe months. Small, non-lethal doses, enough to blur his awareness and inhibit memory formation. A search warrant was issued for the medicine cabinet in Charles's home. Inside, police found dozens of unmarked capsules in a small brown bottle tucked behind routine prescriptions. Lab tests confirmed that the pills contained a mixture of benzodiazepines and crushed, over-the-counter sleep aids, nothing a pharmacy would have mixed, but easy enough to make at home with the right tools. Emily had access to those tools through her baking equipment and the capsules matched a brand she had purchased online 6 months earlier, according to receipts recovered from her browser history. As evidence against Emily piled up, the prosecution began preparing a formal charge for premeditated murder, but they knew a conviction would still be difficult without proving she had physically committed the crime. Motive and circumstantial evidence could paint a convincing picture, but juries wanted facts: DNA, fingerprints, confessions. And in this case, Emily had been careful, too careful, until the neighbor came forward. Janice Holloway lived directly across from Charles Turner and had always kept to herself, but the chaos of the case had pulled her out of her routine. One morning, she walked into the police station holding a small camera. Janice had a motion-activated wildlife camera set up in her backyard, mostly to monitor raccoons and the occasional coyote. It also had a wide field of view toward Charles's back entrance. She wasn't sure if it had caught anything important, but she handed it over anyway. The footage revealed a new piece of the puzzle. On the night Nathan disappeared, around 8:10 p.m., a figure matching Emily's build was seen wheeling a large, covered object through Charles's backyard. The tarp-covered shape was placed into the back of a vehicle, her sedan. She was alone, no signs of Charles. No second figure. Just one woman methodically loading something heavy in the dark. Investigators used digital enhancement to isolate key frames. The shape and height of the figure matched Emily. Her walk, her build, even the way she pulled the tarp over the object, was consistent with her known gestures from other security footage. It wasn't direct proof of murder, but it was damning. At the same time, forensic analysts returned results from soil samples collected from the treads of Emily's car. The composition matched precisely with the trail near where Nathan had been buried down to a rare combination of clay, decomposed pine, and quartz fragments. It was a unique match, one that left little doubt her vehicle had been there during the burial. Emily's attorney tried to stall, requesting more time to review the evidence, but the prosecution moved forward. A grand jury was assembled, and within days they returned an indictment: first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and attempted elder abuse. The charges were read aloud in a packed courtroom. Emily sat expressionless, hands folded in her lap, wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked deliberately somber. She pleaded not guilty. The trial was set to be one of the most watched in the state's history. Media vans parked outside the courthouse. True crime podcasts ran daily updates. Every new detail was devoured by an audience obsessed with the case. Was Emily a cunning killer or a misunderstood woman caught in bizarre circumstances? Had she planned everything, or was she simply an opportunist who took things too far? As the prosecution built its timeline for the trial, a theory began to form with chilling clarity. Emily had spent months laying the groundwork. She began controlling Nathan's finances subtly, creating a gap between him and his father by inserting herself as the intermediary. She isolated Charles slowly, becoming his caretaker, his confidant, and ultimately his sedator. When Nathan discovered her deception and prepared to cut her off both emotionally and financially, she acted swiftly. On the night Nathan was killed, she likely lured him into believing they would talk, perhaps reconcile, or explain everything. Instead, she incapacitated him, either by lacing a drink or using blunt force quickly. She transported the body using Charles's property to avoid detection, buried him in the woods, then returned to stage confusion. 2 days later, she married Charles, believing it would solidify her control and prevent suspicion. But the cracks formed almost immediately. Emily underestimated the small things. The camera across the street, the soil under her tires, the digital footprint of her online capsule purchases, the notes Nathan left behind. And ultimately, her confidence was her downfall. Charles Turner, removed from her care, began improving slowly. Under proper treatment and away from the substances he had unknowingly ingested, he regained some clarity. He couldn't recall everything, but during a court-ordered interview, he said one thing clearly: "She told me we'd be happy once he was gone." That single sentence was added to the official record. The evidence, now overwhelming, set the stage for a high-stakes courtroom battle. Emily would soon face a jury of 12 strangers who would decide her fate. But to the investigators who had unraveled her carefully woven story, the conclusion had already become evident. Emily had buried more than a husband. She had buried the illusion of innocence, and what lay beneath was finally beginning to surface. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet intensity as the trial of Emily Turner began. It was standing room only, with reporters packed along the back wall, and every seat filled by members of the community, many of whom had once considered Emily a friend, a neighbor, a model citizen. Now she sat at the defense table, cold and composed, her face expressionless as if untouched by the weight of the accusations stacked against her. The prosecution opened with a timeline so precise it painted a chilling portrait of premeditation. They laid out the facts: Emily's quiet embezzlement of Nathan's construction business, the manipulation of Charles Turner, the secret marriage just 2 days after the funeral, and most damning, the mounting evidence placing her at the crime scene. They called it not a crime of passion but a calculated act of elimination. Nathan, the one person standing in the way of her full control, had simply become expendable. One by one, witnesses were called. Nathan's co-worker described his increasing suspicion in the weeks leading up to his death, and she had told him in a soft voice not to worry. It showed control, manipulation, and intent. They claimed the soil on Emily's tires could have come from any wooded area. They argued that the GPS data only proved proximity, not murder. They suggested that the financial discrepancies could have been the result of poor bookkeeping, not fraud. As for the marriage, they portrayed it as a desperate, irrational choice made by two grieving people clinging to each other in a moment of emotional chaos. Doubt in the science, doubt in the memories of an aging man, doubt in the narrative pieced together by circumstantial evidence. And from a man who had once been under Emily's complete care, it revealed just how much influence she had exerted. That Nathan had gone away, that things would be better now. That the two of them, her and Charles, could finally be happy. When the prosecutor asked him to explain what that meant, Charles simply said, "I think she meant Nathan wasn't coming back." They emphasized the deliberate pattern of behavior that led to Nathan's death and the calculated moves that followed. She stood, nodded once, and was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The woman who had once charmed a neighborhood, who had built a life of illusion, was now just another inmate behind bars. They painted a picture of a woman who had mastered the art of blending in, of playing the part of the perfect wife and daughter-in-law while methodically dismantling the lives around her. The financial expert detailed the forged invoices and money trail. A forensic geologist confirmed the rare mineral composition in the soil found on Emily's car matched the grave site. A bench was installed at the edge of the trail near where he had been found, marked with a small plaque that read, "Gone but not forgotten." He returned to his home for a short time, but eventually moved into a long-term care facility on the outskirts of town. The bakery she once ran remained closed, the windows still covered in dust. Her story became a cautionary tale, whispered between neighbors, debated in online forums, and retold in documentaries and crime podcasts. Visitors were few. His garden grew wild. A digital analyst presented the GPS data that mapped Emily's route to and from the woods on the night of Nathan's murder. She remained silent, her gaze fixed ahead, rarely blinking, never showing emotion. But to the jury, her silence spoke volumes. She had hosted charity events, baked for the town's fundraisers, and cared for a widowed father-in-law when no one else did. She wore grief like a cloak and used kindness as a disguise. There was no trace of grief for Nathan, no visible remorse, no reaction to the overwhelming evidence or to Charles's heartbreaking testimony. And finally, Janice Holloway, the neighbor, took the stand to describe the strange figure moving through Charles's backyard under cover of darkness, wheeling a tarp-covered object toward a waiting car. Then came Charles Turner. Escorted by a nurse and looking much older than when the investigation began, Charles sat quietly for a moment before speaking. His voice was soft but clear. "Someone who knew your name and brought you pie when your mother was sick." He admitted that his memory was fragmented, unreliable in places, but certain moments had started returning. He remembered Emily visiting constantly, preparing his meals, handling his medications. He recalled moments of confusion, days when he would lose time or forget conversations. And then, most painfully, he remembered something else, a conversation not long before the wedding. He had asked Emily why Nathan hadn't come by. He remembered feeling concerned, His testimony stunned the courtroom. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was as close to a confession from the shadows as they had gotten. The defense, for their part, tried to discredit the evidence. Emily never testified. Her lawyers advised against it, knowing that one misstep could unravel their fragile defense. The closing arguments were brief but powerful. The prosecution reminded the jury that Emily had every motive: money, control, and fear of exposure. The defense simply asked the jury to consider doubt. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, fraud, evidence tampering, attempted elder abuse. The sentence was swift: life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Emily showed no visible reaction. But the impact of her actions lingered far beyond the courtroom. Charles Turner never fully recovered. Though his mind slowly stabilized, the emotional damage remained. Nathan's memory lived on through quiet tributes. His construction firm, now managed by a friend, established a scholarship fund in his name for local students pursuing trade work. Emily's former home was sold. The new owners painted it a different color and tore out the front garden. But the most haunting part of it all was how normal it had once seemed. To those who had known her, Emily Turner had been warm, gentle, and attentive, and that was the scariest truth of all. The monster didn't look like a monster. It looked like someone you might trust, someone who smiled when you passed them on the street. In the end, it wasn't just Nathan who had been buried. It was trust, community, innocence, and it would take Willow Creek a long time to recover.